gathering in our learning and looking at models, and then really connecting our questions and interacting with us. So inviting lots of that between our hosted spaces, and then we're going to also have be weaving in and out through our themes and through some of the different teachings, some more formalized ways of leading those conversations. Starting quite soon. We'll have some interviews together in about 20 minutes. But we just wanted to start you off. When we put out our invitation, we had a number of pillars that we named, the depth, breadth, power, friendship pieces. And just to share with you a little bit where that came from for us, we noticed that as we're taking our own hosting practices out into the world, there's things that support us, and there's areas that we notice we meet our edges. There's areas that we need to pay attention to if we really want to be deepening our practice and creating sustainable work. And there's places that we notice consistently seem to be themes of blind spot areas where we fall down pit holes sometimes, or we receive feedback from certain areas where it's like, oh yeah, we better pay a bit more attention to that. And so in our journey of learning with that, these are 4 of the areas that stood out for us. I'm sure there's more. Some of them may be firmly still in the blind spot zone. Other ones we haven't necessarily chosen here. But we just wanted to dive into them a little bit. Chris, Tuesday, Tim, and I, we thought we'd riff a little bit off of some of our own thinking, some of our own questions on each of these areas. We're not going to go into a full, thorough teach about it, but we just wanted to wake it up. In our collective consciousness, in your own inquiries and learning, these are some threads and themes that you can be curious about with us and that we can use to guide some of our learning. So what we thought we would do, you're welcome to stay where you are or come in a little closer. We're not going to be drawing lots of pictures, but we're just doing a little power share, a little power inquiry around some of these topics. We decided yesterday when we were planning this that we'd each choose one, and we just talk about it for a couple minutes, whatever it is that's alive in our mind about it, as kind of an alive inquiry for us. So we had the fun idea of giving ourselves 2 minutes with our little timer to talk about it a little bit, and then the rest of us will dive in a little bit and share other thoughts that we have, and then we'll just move to the next one. That's enough from me. That's what that's telling me.
We're doing the car home. I was like, which one should I choose?
Yeah. I like to pick different ones.
Ooh.
Pick a different one. We'll spend the whole time choosing from our
Okay.
So we're going to do that. We're going to talk a little bit about each one, and then we're actually going to go into some more conversation and interviews together and carry this along with us as we go. Sound good? Anything anybody else want to add?
Should we explain the thing? Like we're going to do 2 minutes and then.
Yeah, yes, 2 minutes from one of us, and then 3 minutes of the other ones diving in with our whatever sounds we end up choosing, helping to guide us, give us a little bit of helpful structure. Because my goodness, we could talk forever. So, anything else you want to add about that?
Nope.
Good. Okay. So I thought I would start a little bit with depth. We have these areas: depth, breadth, power, and friendship. And I jumped on choosing depth because it feels like it's such an important piece of my work and the heart in my work. And I really see being able to work at a personal level of depth and then connect that to a level of depth in teams and out into the network of people that I'm working with, that the combination of those 2 things is so crucial. And I really find I can't do one without the other. And if I'm not doing a deep level of my own personal work, I can feel that when I get out there. It's fine when everything is inspired and beginning in a happy, inspiring place, but as soon as we hit the groan zone, as soon as we hit some of the complexities, some of the challenges, some of the conflict, some of the uncertainty that has to be there if we're doing good new work, we've got to get into that zone. If I haven't done my own work, I can't host other people in that space. Whatever I'm bringing in is going to be the limit of the work that I could do with them, and actually it can be the sinking place for me as a host or a leader. And then at the same time, I want to be in a position to invite that level of depth in the work that I'm doing with others. So it doesn't stop with me and my personal work. I think sometimes that's a misunderstanding that happens around the personal piece about how do I then also be in a level of depth of conversation with the people and the core teams I'm working with, the people that I'm inviting into these conversations. How do we work at that level of depth together so that when things start to get crunchy, or when we want to really step into some new territory, we've got the ground that holds us to do that. And we're working from all our levels. We're not just working from what I call the cheekbones up. I can't do the kind of work I want to do and bring my heart into it and bring all the other levels of knowing and connection I have if I'm not working at that level of depth. To me, that feels like some of what that's inviting. It's inviting a level of work. It's inviting a level of connection with other people. And I've certainly been in projects, when you look at the area of challenge in that, it all sounds great, but I've been in lots of projects where pieces of that have been missed, where I've noticed where I've missed it myself, or I've felt the team missing it. So that's a good place for you guys to dive in, if you've ever felt that. So what about you guys? What do you have to say about depth?
I don't have much to add because everything I was thinking about relates to the breadth thing I'm going to talk about. I was like, oh, that relates to the...
I mean, they're not individual.
Well, there is something about this, like, and I'm going to say this in the breadth thing, but like, the more mainstream this work becomes, and the more kind of like normal it becomes, the more visible we are, and then actually the more visible we are, the more vulnerable we are to attack. Right? And so the depth is what enables you to withstand attack. Whether that's being on a phone-in on the radio where you're being called a sham, whether that's when you're being outmaneuvered by somebody within your organization or whatever it might be. Yeah?
I'm sorry, people are feeling that.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think, so the other thing I would add is let's don't pretend this is linear. I get deep in myself, I do deep work. I have to get deep in myself to do deep work. Some of us are in really deep work, and then we have to go deeper into ourselves. And so there's just, for me, I think the mistake is linearity here. If this, then that. I think, yes, to hold deep work, you must have depth, but sometimes you're asked into deep work, and that calls you into a depth that you didn't know you had internally. And so for me, it's actually quite reciprocal, and it's not so linear. And so
I think there's a piece of the when we talk about some of the blind spots around how we're constantly negotiating between, especially working at the team level, between going deep and being productive. And there seems to be like a constant, somebody's feeling that.
That was me, so you too.
A constant demand to be able to show productivity from a team that, and Meg was talking about it earlier in terms of the tech sector. The agile processes can be very, very productive, and then you see at the end of the day, it's incredibly exploitative. So I know people in the gaming industry that are just burned out. They're invited to work 18-hour days, and we'll give you free pizza, and it's so cool. You can sleep under your desk, and then you'll have great stories about all of that, right? And so you produce and produce and produce, but you don't get to the level of depth that can actually sustain that. And I think that there's a negotiation there to do all the time, because sometimes you do have to be productive.
And it's like it goes the other way too, where people get totally attached to like
depth.
being in like deep conversations with each other, and nothing ever happens.
And that becomes a blind
like for
spot.
an entrepreneur like me, that's like the most like horrible misuse of participatory process possible.
Right.
Because for me, it's about getting shit done. This is the most effective way to get shit done in the world that I've discovered. Right? And so it's like when suddenly all we're doing is languishing in self-indulgent depth. Right? Like I'm done. I'm like, yeah, let's do something with this. Like we're not going deep.
Or we confuse depth with being over our heads.
Yeah, right.
or emotion.
Right. Or we confuse depth with getting something done. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it's great. It's a
Cool.
journey.
Right.
It's a journey.
Oh, look at that, 5 minutes.
Boom.
Okay, and
My turn?
I mean, your turn to time.
Oh, my turn to time. Okay, I'll tell you.
who's going? Breadth or power?
Depth, breadth, power, and friendship. Right. So there's a rhythm to that, isn't there?
There will be by the end of the 3 days.
Yeah. So the breadth piece, a lot of my work has been exploring this civic engagement stuff, where we're reaching out across cities, communities, towns, regions to try and engage people. And the kind of the driving question behind it was, how in a World Cafe, what you're able to do is surface patterns. So everybody can see them, and then the collective intelligence gets made visible, or the opinion of the room gets made visible. Right? And so I was interested in how you do that across a city. Like, how do you do that across a region? How do you do that across a nation? And if you were able to do that effectively, how will that fundamentally shift how decisions are getting made by people who hold power and influence? So that's the kind of driving question behind it. And then what I very quickly discovered was that events are completely insufficient to do that kind of scale of work. So we've been combining, participatory events with online social media strategies and kind of like websites that gather information, and then also with kind of like street-based engagement where we've got mime artists on the streets or musicians or that kind of stuff. So it's really brought together these worlds that are actually all coming from the same place in terms of participation and saying what happens if we combine these things and how do we actually aggregate patterns of information across very large areas. So that's the kind of stuff that has been exciting for me, and I think it's a lot of where it's going. And we know there's a lot of art of hosting work that's across whole organizations now, or across the European Commission where loads of people have been trained, and so there's all that kind of stuff going on. And then the kind of like some of the edges in it for me is that, done? Almost. All right, resource intensive, very resource intensive, it's expensive. How do we do that? It can end up being shallow. Very broad reach can end up being shallow. You compromise on depth.
How quickly that can wash your brain.
Yeah. And ultimately, when I'm getting involved in these kind of broad work, often the people who are inviting me in aren't interested in learning. They just want the result. They want the information. They want the information that we're able to gather, but they're not interested in the methodology or culture that is able to gather that quality and depth of information. So I just end up being a service rather than transforming the culture that deals with the data. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Cool. I would jump in a little bit to say, in addition to that, I'm really curious about this idea of breadth that isn't as obvious. So it's not necessarily that I'm trying to do a project that clearly has a scale of breadth, but what are some of the things that aren't just about scaling up, but is kind of invisible breadth? So how does the natural network of some of what I'm doing have a breadth that I might not even know about? And how can I be doing the work that I'm doing on a smaller scale, but by almost leaving the walls open and fertilizing the ground and setting up networks and setting up learning that allows a kind of breadth to travel organically, as well as when I'm doing something purposely on a larger scale.
Cool.
That's like curious about what my learning on each of those feed each other.
So I was thinking about the different experiences of breadth that we can have. One is breadth as an exhilarating experience and how we can get fooled by scale and breadth. And
10,000 people have been trained in the art of hosting.
So exciting.
10,000 people were reached by this engagement.
Right? So there's something about not allowing ourselves to get seduced by breadth, and at the same time not letting ourselves be intimidated and move off of it. So that for me is always a real, because I can get really excited and then I can get a real head trip about the importance of the work. Right? Because it's, whoa. And so there's something about not getting fooled, but also not being afraid to step in and having the courage to step in around breadth. And then the other thing is, I think sometimes, it's especially when people are talking about breadth and as opposed to depth, for example, that realistic expectations come into play more. What does it mean to engage 5,000 people? What is it that we're actually able to do? We can talk about engaging 5,000 people. We can talk about working, who's mostly big people, 20 counties. But what does that mean we're able to do in those counties?
Love it.
I think one of the things, when you put breadth and depth together like this, is you have, breadth is the place where your control ends. So if you're planning on scaling and you have a plan for how that's going to happen, you're just deluded. I mean, we're just deluding ourselves to imagine how something can scale over time. And yet, when we're doing like social change initiatives where we are so, where the result is so important, right? Like when I think of justice or I think of safety or I think of something like that, we want it to scale out and we want the result to be the one that we want, And so it's like how you scale breadth and depth out together is really interesting, but I meet in those places my control freak, right? That says that I know how this is going to work across all of society. I call it my world domination strategy. I've got an awesome world domination strategy, and if you would all just see the world the way I do, everything would be fine, and what the hell's wrong with you all? So it's really fascinating to be able to study and learn about ways in which transformation travels and ideas shift and travel. And I think we've got to get really good at that.
Can I just, one last thing here, like the piece that excites me here, and is that, and I've seen this happen in the city of Halifax, is that if we're able to effectively and consistently surface public opinion, it changes the decisions that political leaders make, because that's how they get votes. Right? So actually you're able, the potential of this type of work is that directionality of society begins to move into the realm of the citizen. Directionality, right? So, but not that it doesn't have all of these blind spots and all of this weirdness in it, but like there's something there that is quite exciting for me.
Well, that leads me into mine. Okay. Right. So, power. So here are 5 little provocative statements about power in this work. First of all, power is always operative. It's always operative. We're never existing in a context where power is not either allowing us, well, there's a lot of power allowing us to do it, or power is somehow scheming about how to undermine what we're doing. Don't fool yourself. Power is always operative, and power is often operative invisibly, right? And so this is not conspiracy theory. I mean, I'm not sort of like, like they're always out for us, but, don't be naive. Like, just how many times have I been caught thinking that what we've got is the greatest thing going, and it just turns out that the people with all the power and the influence in the organization just don't see it that way, right? And so there's always somebody outside of the realm of who we can reach that has a no, right? Who's that person? So power is always operative. Second little provocative things. When you are hosting, you are always exercising power, right? So how are you with your privilege? How are you with power? Because when you're hosting, you're always exercising power. And you're always going to meet yourself. I'm always going to meet myself. I always meet myself in my, my capabilities and my incompetencies around wielding power and privilege when I'm hosting. But hosting is even hosting participatory processes where the ideas are coming from the group, where the community is in charge. When you're hosting, you're always exercising power, and people will always see you that way. You are always seen that way. So that's fine. It's just what it is. But it's useful to bring these to our practice of participatory leadership to me. Third one, self-organization and emergence are influenced by power and privilege. Self-organization and emergence is this beautiful thing. It's always influenced by power and privilege. Who I choose to spend my time with, is always influenced by who I'm comfortable with, right? So don't get fooled into believing that when we create self-organizing systems that we're free of all of that. Fear and power are unsafe without trust. When we confront uncertainty and failure and people get afraid and they have power, suddenly you really see the teeth that you run into. Fear and power are unsafe without trust, right? When people are powerful are afraid by the uncertainty, you're in trouble. And there are always people you will be afraid to include. There will always be people you will be afraid to include. And so, as I was fond of saying during Occupy, every neo-Nazi skinhead you've ever met is in the 99%. Every single one. Right? So there's
3 hours. I'll put it on 2 minutes. Start.
What I would say is, Chris said when you're hosting, you're exercising power. Absolutely. Optics, even whatever you're doing hosting, even the optics of who's hosting has power in it, just, in this country right now. And then the other thing that I would add to that is harvesting is power too. So when we talk about harvesting, we talk about making meaning of what you're hearing and presenting it back to people, even if you share with people. For me, if it's important, I almost always want to, I'll harvest that one. I'll make sense of that. I'll write that report. I gotcha. So harvesting, making sense. It's not just the being up front in the room, but it's bringing it back, massaging the information. That seems very obvious, but often harvesting is seen as a record kind of role. And it's actually quite powerful and can absolutely shape the next bit of work.
A little piece that I would add and that I'm curious about and exploring is just, in addition to the way that we can see that power actually moves, how do our beliefs about power then add to how we're able to work well with power, or how we're not able to work well with power. So that goes a lot into the fear zone with people. A lot of the work I do, it's amazing how much fear and power and control and power, which tends to come from fear and power, relate to each other. And sometimes just misunderstandings, either blind spots about power or overprojection about power, can just tangle the whole power issue up. So it's a good area for getting clear in our own thinking, as well as just knowing what some of these principles are. So curious about how.
Yeah, man. So my belief as a kid of experiencing very rare, in fact, I don't think until I was like in my early 20s did I experience power being handled with integrity. So I basically had a belief that power corrupts you. And like what that did was stop me stepping into my own power. Stopped me stepping into my own power, and stopped me being able to meet people who held power of any kind, being able to meet them where they're at. So, I feel like we have to get over our fear that power corrupts us so we can actually meet it in the world. Like, that's been my kind of journey around it.
Yeah, and it's rampant. I hear it all over the place.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. And like, I've the CEO in me has to be able to come out to meet the CEOs I work with.
So it's both. So I just want to, because it's the fear that power corrupts. You have to deal with that, but also the acknowledgement that power can corrupt.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's right.
That's
right.
Both at the same time.
Yeah.
It's not.
None of these things are straightforward.
Yeah.
It's not like either one or the other. So how do we not just rest in one or the other? It's like see it, acknowledge it, and then what's the piece that can be cleaned off in my thinking about it, so I can relate to that well.
Wicked. All right.
Somebody got me for friendship.
I got
2 minutes?
2 minutes.
I got it.
2 minutes.
Oh, you got one.
Good speed dating, friendship. So I think what I would say about friendship, one of the things we said in the invitation, and that I've been saying a lot, is friendship is a pillar of strategic change, or a strategic pillar of change. That's Tim's language. And so I believe that. I believe that when we're talking about this kind of change, friendship almost always, whether it's acknowledged or not, comes into play. And the more we can be friends, the deeper, the more meaningful, and perhaps the broader that change can be. And so, and I'm not talking about like milquetoast kind of pale friendship. I think friendship is a radical act. It's a decision. It's a practice. How will I be friends with you? What does that look like over time? What does that mean when the rubber hits the road and I'm your funder? What does that mean? When friendship is a radical act, I'm going to be friends with you, doesn't mean I'm not going to make hard choices with you, or I'm not going to make hard decisions for you, or I'm not going to exercise my power. But being in friendship is a really fundamentally different way of working. If I can allow you to be my friend, as well as my colleague, as well as my boss, as well as a stakeholder. Friendship is a radical act. And it's not weak, it's actually quite powerful. So there's the other piece that I want to say about friendship is friendship can absolutely bring more accountability, right? That can be a way it helps us get more work done. I would rather eat my toes than let Deb Helber down. Like if I tell her I'm going to do something,
easier to eat your toes.
I just, if I tell her I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. May not be that day, I run a little late, but I'm going to do it because we're friends, and that's a huge way the work gets done. We can be accountable to each other. But I do not fool myself. I also worked in family violence for years. The people who love you are the people who may be the people who hurt you most. And so there's also the piece where friendship absolutely has no accountability. And that people who we are friends with, we can not say no to. We can accept things from that we would never accept otherwise. And so it can both bring super accountability and it can help us lose all accountability. And so that edge is really important. Last thing, friendship is a practice. We have to have I would just say the word grace. Friendship means not only that I'm able to be in a relationship and perhaps extend grace to you when I am wronged by you, but I have to have grace for myself to practice friendship well with you. It doesn't mean you let your friends treat you any old way, but it means I'm willing to stay in relationship if you're willing to stay in relationship.
Cool. 2 minutes. There's the whole thing for me, like the art of hosting has a lot of stuff around friendship in it, and there's a kind of like cynical part of me, like, really, people actually, So like, I'm English. It takes a long time to become my friend. Like I'm not like a leap-in friend. I'm not a quick joiner. I'm not. So I'm often in like, what's the level of relationship we need to do the work that we need to get done in front of us? And there's different depths of friendship and different depths of relationship that are needed for different depths and quality of work. And so sometimes this thing can feel very fluffy and unclear to me and untrustworthy because of the way the word is handled. And I just want to say that.
Yeah.
Let's say friendship makes interdependence visible. So when you adopt friendship as a practice, I think what you're adopting is an acknowledgement of the interdependence of all living things.
Yeah, right.
And so that the radical act of befriending your enemy, right? The radical act of befriending your enemy is not so much about making friends with your oppressor; it's about acknowledging the interdependence in some way.
Lovely.
I
love that. I love that.
And just jumping off that, I would say it's been so helpful for me in my own practice to really engage with what do I mean by friendship, and what does the whole concept of friendship mean, and be able to expand that beyond my grade 4 version of what it means to be somebody's friend, and what it means if they're my friend, and if they did this, then they're not my friend, and if you are your friend, you have to come to your birthday party, like all that very base level, what is a friend? And so I think by challenging that and stretching that and looking at what are some of our basic principles of friendship and how they can show up in different ways at those different levels, and how I can stretch myself, like what would it mean in this situation with this team of people where we've got some differences and struggles? What would it mean to bring in some level of friendship here? What would I have to stretch in myself? Where do I push up against that and pay some attention there? So it's like for me, some things around kindness, around the willingness to stay, around the willingness to be human together. How can I bring that in different ways at different levels without it being fake? And how can I be a friend to myself in that stuff too? Because I can't do all this work if I'm not tending that relationship as well.
So one way these 4 things are poking and prodding this inquiry in me is to look at them in tension with each other. It's depth and breadth can be in tension, depth and power can be in tension, depth and friendship. All of these you could set up as polarities.
That's right.
Fascinating. And it's really hard to achieve them all at once. So it's a constant practice of moving between them. Right? Depth, breadth, power, and friendship.
And it's like, these are, like, in my experience, these are like essential for the work. Exploring these things is essential for the work, and they're like fundamental parts of all of my work, but they're also the areas where I feel like I'm learning the most and know the least, even though they're the areas that I'm exploring and practicing in the most. Does that make sense? So I've got like the most knowledge here and the least knowledge here, or something.
Yeah, I know totally. What you made me think is like all of these I could say, I think that's true, all of these I could say they're important and not enough.
Yeah.
Right? Like every single one of these, to have a good understanding of power, to have a good willingness to work with power is important, but it's not enough. Right? Friendship, same thing. It'll get you there. It's like what you said about seeing the bigger picture. Yeah. Important, not enough. Breadth, all of those things for me, like, this is the inquiry.
Essential but insufficient alone.
Yeah. See, look, when you have a poet.
Right.
Awesome. Essential but insufficient alone. Beautiful.
Put poet on your friendship list.
Nice.
Have a poet. That's my
Sweet. So there's a little from us in this conversation that we're continuing to be in with ourselves and each other, and hopefully you guys. We just invite those as threads. You'll have lots of time to be in your own questions and your own sharing about this in our interviews and in the in the rest of our time together and ongoing from here. So this is just a little chance to wake that up, and I think I'll move us into the interview space. Great. So we know that you've all showed up here with your own work.